grab this real quick. I have notes today, so it'll be a little more organized and less chaotic. There we go. Okay. Chaos is always fun, except when you're on microphone and camera, then it's less fun, right? So, but thank you all so much. Thank you, Russ, for the lovely introduction, for having me out here today. It's always a treat to be here with people on college campuses and to talk to you all about, serious ideas. So my talk today, when I was sitting down and writing it, I kind of envisioned 3 parts. But they're really kind of one part that flows somewhat mixed up in a weird order. But I'm going to try to keep it straight. So first, what I want to do is start off with, what is limited government? What does it mean? And more importantly, what does it not mean? The second would be to go through James Buchanan's 3 types of government. And then the third and final part will be the unacknowledged costs of too much government and how you could tell when there was too much. Okay. So what I want you to do right now is just imagine something. Imagine for a minute that you have a house, which for anyone under 40 is, probably laughable, but for the rest of us, we can think about this. Okay, so imagine for a minute that you have a house, and you've hired a contractor to remodel the bathroom. Okay, this is totally reasonable, right? People do this almost every single day. Now imagine that the contractor decides on their own, without any input from you, that they're also going to remodel the kitchen. They're going to do so without consulting you on what colors, styles, types of equipment, anything like that. They're going to charge you for it, and then they're going to tell you that they're doing so for your own good. That's no longer a contractor. That's a problem. Okay? And unfortunately, that is what a lot of government activity today is like. We want some of the things that they do. But the question is, what do we actually hire them to do? Okay. Now, this talk is not meant to be a government bad, markets good spiel. That's a bumper sticker. That's not a serious conversation. So what we're going to talk about today is a simple question. What is government for, and what happens when it does more than that? So limited government is often characterized as meaning something like anarchism or no rules. If you've seen Talladega Nights, the kids running around screaming anarchy and then spraying each other with hoses, okay? Or maybe it means like no roads, or letting poor people starve or otherwise suffer, or some idea of everyone being out there only for themselves. That's not a serious, no one serious is actually arguing that ever. No one who thinks about these questions at a deep, actual level is ever making the argument that poor people should suffer. What people are really asking when they're talking about limited government is a very simple question. Is government really the best way to accomplish a given goal? Or is there a way that would accomplish that goal in an actually materially, and dare I even say ethically, better way? Now, you often hear this ignored in political debates. You'll hear things like, if we don't pass this healthcare subsidy, people will die. If you don't pass this education package, people won't be able to go to college. Who will build the roads and make sure that our drinking water is safe? Who is going to make sure that workers are paid enough and that their safety is protected? The hidden assumption here is that if the government doesn't do it, then it won't happen at all. But that doesn't seem true if we actually look around the world and look through even just recent history. So, what I want to get into is Buchanan's work. So James Buchanan was a Nobel Prize winning economist. I'm not talking about the American president, right? I'm talking about the economist. He broke down government activity into basically 3 distinct areas. The first he called the protective state, then there's the productive state, and then finally there's what he calls the predatory state. Now, the protective state, this is the idea that governments can protect people. They can do things like enforce contracts and protect property rights. They can hire police, etc. Right here, the government is basically acting like a referee does in a sporting contest. So if you watch basketball in the last 24 hours, there are referees on the court. Right? They are not supposed to be playing. They are enforcing agreed upon rules to make sure that the play can continue smoothly. The productive state, this is the idea that the government can act within society and become a means by which the citizens can accomplish desired ends that would otherwise be kind of difficult. National defense is a classic example here. We can all agree that national defense might need to exist, that the optimal size of the military is more than one, right? But how big should it be? And who's going to pay for it? Right? So here we're thinking about genuine public goods provision, and that includes paying for these things too. So in other words, the power to tax comes out of the productive state. Continuing the sports analogy, the productive state would be like the general manager of the arena. They help create the space for the players to actually play the game. But the general manager is not on the court playing the game themselves. Okay? Finally, there's the predatory state. So this is where the state uses its productive ability to reward well-connected people. And here, think any time you've ever thought, the rich are getting richer in conjunction with politics. In the sports analogy, imagine that the referee no longer was simply blowing the whistle and calling, balls and strikes, in or out or anything like that, but they were actually like playing the game. So in like basketball, imagine if the referee, someone's shooting a free throw and the referee comes up and like swats the ball out of their hand and says, "You missed." We would think that something was wrong. We would look at that as unfair. We would look at that as like fundamentally not the referee's job. That's the predatory state here. So the key challenge that Buchanan lays out is how do we enable the protective and genuinely productive state without simultaneously unleashing the predatory state? And this, if you read through the Federalist Papers or any of the founding documents for the US and plenty of other governments around the world, this was near and dear to their hearts. Look at Madison 51, or Federalist 51 by James Madison, right? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. The simple fact that we are not angels necessitates the creation of government. But the very next sentence says, if angels were to govern man, no internal or external controls on government would be necessary. So the very fact that government is going to be constituted by people means that it will be imperfect. That means we need rules. We need safeguards. We need limits on what they can do. The unchecked power of a government official would be horrifying. And we've seen that. Not necessarily in the US, but in history. Okay? And so what the goal of limited government is, it's never to reduce or shrink the protective or productive state. It's to enable them to thrive while constraining the predatory state. Okay? Now, federalism, the idea that local governments should be reigning supreme and that the national government should be subordinate to that government, is at some level the architecture of limited government, not just some historical curiosity. The idea behind federalism is that competition among states and localities acts in much the same way as competition among businesses. States that overtax and underprovide will quickly see their populations dwindle as people move away, thus reducing their tax base and harming their own self-interest. Okay? Voting with your feet, in other words, is a very real and very powerful mechanism. And the 10th Amendment, the one that says that all powers not explicitly granted to the federal government are reserved to the state and the people, provides a very serious check that is supposed to ensure that power stays closest to the people, i.e. with the state and local governments, where you know the person who is delegating or creating rules for you. Limited government, then, isn't about doing nothing. It's about doing the right things and also having the humility to stop at that point, to go no further. Now, what happens when we have too much government? The predatory state that Buchanan warned us about becomes unleashed and in full force. So what I want you to do when you're thinking about any type of example of a policy is keep 3 questions in mind. The first one would be, who benefits from the policy? Who's paying? And then the last one would be, what are the incentives of the policymakers? Usually what we find, and by the way, if I'm going too fast or anything, like just say something, I'll slow down, right? I get excited about these things, and so I keep talking, right? So usually what we find is that a narrow group of people benefits tremendously from a proposed policy. Meanwhile, other ordinary Americans pay in the form of higher taxes and higher prices. And why does this type of thing happen, right? After all, in a democracy where the majority is supposed to rule, why would the concentrated benefits of the few outweigh the dispersed costs of the many? Right? And the answer is that for people that have concentrated benefits, their incentive is to lobby very hard to keep, maintain, or expand those benefits. You and I, here's a good example. How many of you have had a soda in the US in the last, year? Right? How many of you have had soda in Mexico or Canada? Anyone notice a difference between the two? What's the difference?
Sugar versus corn syrup?
Yeah, sugar versus corn syrup. Why do we use corn syrup in the United States?
It's cheaper.
It is cheaper, but the other way to say it is that sugar is more expensive. So here's the thing. There's this magical band called the United States where sugar is really expensive. Why? It's very cheap in Mexico. It's about half the price in Mexico compared to the US. Same is true of Canada. So what's unique about America that makes sugar so expensive?
Some subsidies.
Yeah, there are subsidies involved, and there's severe import quotas. So there's only a limit on how much sugar the US is allowed to import legally before super high tariffs and other fees come into play. As a result, soda companies in the US switched from sugar to high fructose corn syrup. Right? Why? Because sugar is too expensive here. Why is sugar so expensive? The latest study I saw suggested that Americans pay something like $20 more per year on sugar-related products than anyone else in the world. Here's my question to you. How many of you are going to go march on Washington, D.C. over a $20 a year bill? Now that you know this, how many of you are going to do that? Travel to Washington, D.C. and demand from your elected officials that they rescind this sugar quota. Why?
$20 isn't worth the effort.
Yeah, nowhere close to it. How many of you are going to call your elected official and say, hey, I need you to get rid of this? Maybe. Why are the rest of you not going to? $20 a year isn't quite worth your time and effort to make a phone call?
Letter maybe, phone call no.
Letter maybe, phone call no?
$20 a year is probably not enough. The fact that sugar tastes better than high fructose corn syrup.
Yeah. So, okay, so now that you know that it's better, it tastes better, and it's more expensive to go the other way, right? Are you going to call? What are you going to do in light of this information? My guess is almost nothing. What do you think the sugar industry in the United States is going to do? They stand to gain tens of millions of dollars per year from the maintenance of these quotas. Do you think they're going to call Washington and try to convince them to keep those quotas in place? You don't think so?
I think they're going to write a check and then...
Yeah, right. So yeah, okay. They're going to write a check, right, and get the government to pass it that way, right? But they're going to try to maintain that protection, right? Yeah, right? And so the idea is like, look, elected officials are going to respond to what gets them the most votes. If the only people calling Washington are the ones who benefit from the protection, what's Washington going to do? Keep the protection, right? It makes sense once you break it down that way. It's horribly inefficient. Yeah, John.
You're exactly correct, Doctor, because you're seeing the corn syrup industry and the ag industry militating against Bobby Kennedy Jr. at HHS over this very issue.
Yeah.
What you're saying is absolutely prescient right now.
Yeah, so now you're getting into, so the sugar industry wants to maintain it, right? But the corn syrup industry also wants to maintain it because now more people buy corn syrup. I mean, for God's sake, we put corn in our fuel.
Yeah.
That's weird.
We like corn too much here.
We do. It's a weird thing, okay? And so here's the thing. Politicians have incentives. They're going to follow those incentives. If you tell them that, hey, I'll vote for you if you do this, they're going to do it. And if enough people are doing that, they're going to go wherever the votes are, okay? Now, my colleague, his name is Peter Earle, he and I refer to the idea of what government does when it interferes in this way as the reverse Midas touch. So for those of you that don't know King Midas is a fictional figure, thankfully, who whenever he touches anything, it turns into gold. Okay, anything. Right, so it's a wonderful story. You read it. He's touching apples; they turn into solid gold. He touches a chair; it turns into solid gold. Right, his nation is prospering because they have so much gold because he can just touch things. Right, but then he gives his daughter a hug. And she turns into gold. So it's a tragedy, right? But that's the idea behind King Midas, is anything that he touches turns to gold. So a reverse Midas touch would be to touch anything and have it turn into not gold. I won't say the word that Pete and I use in private conversations, but it's certainly a word, right? And so here's the idea. When the government intervenes in their predatory state capacity, usually trying to make something more affordable or more accessible, right? Unfortunately, however, it almost always ends up making things worse. Think about housing, education, and healthcare. These are three areas that everyone is bemoaning as unaffordable. And they're right. They are unaffordable. The average first-time home buyer is now 40. Not 25, 40. The average house that gets built, the new construction, is sold for about $360,000, right? This is wild. If you look at like what people actually want, what new home buyers want, over 55% of them want a house that costs less than $250,000 because that's what they can afford. Only about 12% of houses that are built every year actually meet that criteria. So there's a fundamental mismatch. Why? Two reasons. One, we have state and local governments that have passed zoning ordinances that make it prohibitively difficult to actually construct housing. That is going to restrict the supply. And then two, the federal government keeps coming in subsidizing mortgages. We saw this most recently with President Trump trying to move to a 50-year mortgage away from a 30-year mortgage. Right? The 50-year mortgage, just for some comparison, would save you about $150 a year on your mortgage payments, and it would cost you something like $120,000 extra in interest payments over the additional 20 years. So the savings are basically minuscule, but real, right? $120 a year, not zero, but the cost is huge. And the idea was to try to make mortgages more affordable, with the idea being that if a mortgage is more affordable, people can buy houses. But all that's doing is boosting the demand for housing. When you boost the demand and you restrict the supply, the only result that can happen is higher prices. That's it. Right? Same thing is true in healthcare. Right? We look at the Affordable Care Act. Now, I'm not going to make fun of the Affordable Care Act too much here, but here's kind of the thing. By focusing on health insurance and not health care, what the Affordable Care Act actually ended up accomplishing is about doubling the amount of health care spending in the United States. Now, if you double the amount of spending, you would expect there to be a spike in employment. Not what we see. Looking at BLS data, so the Bureau of Labor Statistics, what we find is 15 years prior to the Affordable Care Act, the healthcare industry in terms of providers of medical services was growing at about 2 to 2.5% per year. In the 15 years since the Affordable Care Act was passed, anyone want to guess what the growth rate for employment in the healthcare providing area is? It's about 2 to 2.5% per year. In other words, there was no massive spike or increase in the amount of people that work in healthcare providing healthcare. Why? Because in 1997, as a part of the Budget Control Act, we froze the number of residencies available to 1996 levels. That was fine in 1997, 1998, maybe even 2000. Today, the American Medical Association estimates that we're short something like 40,000 doctors today, and that by 2030, that number will be over 80,000. In other words, there is a law in Congress that has restricted the supply, making it more difficult to become a doctor. And on top of that, by expanding health insurance coverage, what we've done is boosted the demand. Same thing as housing. What happens when you boost the demand and you restrict the supply? The only result is that prices go up, right? Making things even less affordable. This then leads to a snowball effect, which we can talk about in the Q&A about why health insurance companies keep denying people, the legal battles that they face there, all that kind of stuff. But here's the thing, right? And this is one that I want to be very passionate about. I was on an affordability panel with a couple people just a few weeks ago, and one of the other people was, she's very smart, she's very nice, and she's very bright. Kept saying, well, look, we've increased the number of people that have health insurance. And I said, that's great. If you break your leg and rub a Blue Cross Blue Shield card on it, what happens? And she said, nothing. I'm like, I know, because health insurance is not the same thing as health care. They are complementary goods at best. They are not substitutes. You can have the best insurance in the world. If there's no doctor to go see, it doesn't matter. Right? Now I'll give you an example, and I don't mean to be like weird about this, but like my wife is in the medical field, right? So like I can call any physician in the greater Grand Rapids area, and we can make certain things happen. Like if a doctor is not taking new patients, they are for us, right? So we live a very privileged and existence. Okay, for us, even trying to get a doctor's appointment can be upwards of 6 months for a wait list. Right? What is it for people that don't have the connections that I have? It's going to be a lot longer. It could be years, right? Probably not decades, but it's very, very long, right? And so the idea here is like, look, when you don't have sufficient numbers of people to provide the service, it doesn't really matter how much money you throw at the problem. You're not getting the service. Okay? And so if you want to tackle health care or housing, the answer is not boosting demand. It's not making mortgages or insurance more affordable. It's making more doctors and more houses. That's it. Right? And it's not some Reagan-esque supply side voodoo stuff. This is just straight up Econ 101. If you want more of something at lower prices, that is a supply side issue. Okay? It is not about demand. The unfortunate thing is that what federal policy tends to do is focus on buying. They try to make it easier for people to buy something, thinking that that will increase the amount of it available. It does, at much higher prices. And for people that don't qualify for those programs, the result is just higher prices. Okay? So here's the thing. If you increase demand while constraining supply, the inevitable result, again, is higher prices. This, then, is going to require even more subsidies to fix. Look at the debate surrounding the Affordable Care Act subsidy extension from January, right? Those were passed so that we had a genuine global pandemic, right? It necessitated, extreme measures. We passed an extension or a subsidy for the Affordable Care Act for 5 years thinking, hey, this will get us through the pandemic. It suddenly became required that if we didn't keep it, people would die, would lose their insurance, and everything would unravel. Think about that for a minute, right? There's nothing more permanent than a temporary government program. And that's the problem here. Okay? I'll give you a second example. Consider the past year or so of tariff policy. So tariffs were sold as a means of protecting the American worker, promoting good-paying, reliable, and important domestic manufacturing jobs, and a few other things as well. The benefits of these tariffs were concentrated on particular industries, such as steel and aluminum. By some estimates, the 2018 tariffs on these products saved about 1,000 jobs nationwide. But the costs of these things are dispersed. Every other American paid higher prices for things made of steel and aluminum. The pass-through rate, just so you guys are aware, of the 2018 tariffs was about 5%, which is low. You probably didn't notice it. But when you are a worker in a downstream industry like manufacturing, where you're using steel and aluminum, you're going to feel that 5% cost increase. My favorite example comes from canning. So for those of you that are old enough, how many of you may have noticed that craft beer cans got taller around 2019? Right? Instead of getting a 6-pack of 12-ounce cans, you got a 4-pack of 16-ounce cans. Same volume of beer, but in different packages. Why? Why did aluminum cans get taller in 2019 and 2020? So as it turns out, if you look at where the aluminum in the cans is, it's in the tops and the bottoms. It's where about 90% of all the aluminum in the can is. Basically none is in the sides or the walls. Okay? So if I can make the walls a little bit taller and order 50% fewer tops and bottoms, that's a tremendous material savings. So what did the canning industry do in response to the 5% increase in the price of aluminum and steel? They shifted. But here's the thing. When the canning industry, which is arguably the largest purchaser of aluminum in the United States today, when they start ordering about 50% less aluminum, what do you think happens to the aluminum industry? Yeah. Now here's the thing. Can an aluminum company fire a machine? Not really. They just turn it off. So if they want to save money, where do they go? They cut jobs. So those 1,000 jobs that were saved in the initial period are all gone now. That's why Alcoa and U.S. Steel are teetering on the verge of bankruptcy until some recent developments with Japan coming in and buying them. Which, if you think about last fall, when everyone was up in arms about Japan buying U.S. Steel, now all of a sudden we're okay with it. Interesting, okay? So here's the thing. What we saw with those steel and aluminum tariffs were short-term gains at the expense of long-term pains. This is the exact opposite of what has been promised out of tariffs. They've been promising short-term pains for long-term gains. We're getting the opposite, right? This right now, or the last year, that was as good as it's going to get vis-a-vis tariffs. It is going to get more expensive and worse, okay? And so here's the question. Why? Why do we do these things? because the benefits are clear and visible. Look at J.D. Vance's, campaign speeches. He would talk at length about how certain communities were saved by the steel and aluminum tariffs. And he's right. When 1,000 jobs in the steel and aluminum industry are saved, you can see the factory that didn't shut down, right? You can point to it. It's in Ohio, okay? We know this. But when tens of thousands, so I should say the other side, in the downstream industries, we lost about 75,000 manufacturing jobs because of the higher costs, okay? But that's 1 or 2 people per metropolitan area. Go ahead and name them. You can't. It's almost impossible to identify the people who lost their jobs because of the tariffs, because they're so wide and disparate and not clearly visible, okay? Because of that, what we have is a very highly visible benefit, the factor that didn't shut down, a very dispersed and often invisible cost, but still very real, that is very difficult to identify, okay? So why do we get tariffs? Because it gets votes, okay? But of course, exceptions can be granted to any of these rules, including tariffs, and this leads to a problem of cronyism or favoritism. Right? So is it any wonder that Apple, the makers of my fine laptop here, got an exemption to the tariffs placed on China and India after Tim Cook went to the White House and donated $1 million to Trump's inauguration fund? So when big companies want an exemption, which is always billed as like, hey, we're going to try to help people when these rules hurt them, right? Which is a perfectly innocent thing to do. But when big companies want an exemption, what do? Well, they use their high-powered connections to secure meetings with top administration officials. Oftentimes, they've retained people that used to work in the SEC or the Federal Communications, FCC, or any other 3-letter acronym in Washington, D.C. But when a small business in Ottawa, Kansas needs an exemption, what do? They have to fill out a form at whitehouse.gov and hope that some junior staffer somewhere there sees it and passes it up the chain of command in some sort of a dispassionate way. That's not fair. That's just favoritism. Cronyism then creates a vicious cycle. The government overreaches, the returns to lobbying rise compared to the returns for being productive. Resources then shift from producing things and towards securing exemptions, but this just increases the funds that government has to spend on things, which means they can spend more, which then leads to more overreaching and more lobbying and more returns, shifting the American people away from producing things that actually people need and toward producing exemptions. This is why one of the lasting effects of the Affordable Care Act is not to increase the amount of health care that exists, but to actually increase the number of insurance agents that exist, the number of hospital administrators that exist. The fastest growing field in the medical industry is not physician or nurse practitioner. It's medical billing and coding expert. It's compliance officers, right? That's the issue. Those are great jobs. Unfortunately, they're not productive. They don't add value to society. They're not actually helping patients with a broken leg or with a disease that needs to be seen by a doctor. They're just coding what happened. My favorite is to point out ICD-10 codes. So an ICD-10 code comes from the ICD-10 handbook. And it's a way to bill or code exactly what doctors did and why the patient's there. So here's the thing. ICD-10 codes are so specific. The book is about this thick, just so you're aware. Okay? They're so specific that there is a unique ICD-10 code for if you get sucked into a jet engine and go to your subsequent appointment. Okay, so think about that for a minute. Injuries sustained by being sucked into a jet engine, subsequent appointment. That is a unique ICD-10 code. That's unique from injuries sustained from a jet engine, first appointment. Okay? Have any of you gotten your left foot hurt from a duck that stepped on it? Good. That's an ICD-10 code. Okay? So there are oddly specific ICD-10 codes because of how detailed these things have to be to try to get insurance to reimburse for what's going on. Right? That's the whole purpose. But think about the paperwork involved in this. My wife, as I mentioned, she's a surgeon. What do you think she spends most of her day doing?
Arguing with health insurance companies.
She doesn't do the arguing. She does the paperwork, the charting. Right? She's up every single day until 1 o'clock in the morning filling out charts. She only saw 20 patients that day, but it's going to take her until 1 a.m. to get everything done. And she has to be at work at 8 a.m. the next day. That's every day. When we go on vacation, She brings her work laptop in the car. She sits in the back of the minivan, fires up her phone for a hotspot, and she does her charts. Why? Why would you go to medical school to learn how to fill out paperwork? I thought you went to medical school to learn how to help people. Okay? So the system we have today has created this problem. Right? That's the issue. And that's what limited government proponents are really getting at, is saying not that the government should do nothing, but that the system we have right now is fundamentally rewarding the wrong things. It's rewarding paperwork over productivity. That's a problem. Okay? So, what the result of all of this is, especially for young people, is that who you know rather than who you are becomes more and more important. If you want to break into an industry, you almost always need a connection. The well-connected are going to end up thriving. The not so well-connected fall behind. And this is exactly what we're seeing today. So the question has never been government or no government. The question has always been, who is the government working for, and are they serving the best interests? And with that, I want to close here and open it up for Q&A. Thanks so much.
With the Q&A, I have Professor Dr. Peter Jacobson of the Gordon Institute from Ottawa is here, and then we're going to put it over to James from KPI, and then we'll open the floor, and we'll kind of let you drive the ship after that with fielding questions. So, sure. Dr. Jacobson.
So Professor Hebert, you started off with the distinction of the different functions of government and wanted to pinpoint specifically on the predatory, and I think that's valuable. I do wonder, though, to what extent there are positive relationships between, for example, the productive state and the predatory state when you introduce things like public choice concerns. Do we need to focus on cutting down productive or protective, for that matter, if we think about like military-industrial complex issues, in order to cut down on the predatory? What's the right plan of action for how we engage with government?
Yeah, it's a great question. So Scott King actually wrote his dissertation on the linkage, if you will, between the productive and the predatory state. And the argument that he makes, and I want to be very careful not to put words in his mouth, both because he's a mutual friend and because I don't want to misrepresent what he says, is that once you have enabled the productive state, you have, by definition, unleashed, at least to an extent, the predatory state. Because after all, once you're going to say, the government has the ability to start purchasing things, who they purchase from and under what sort of terms becomes a relevant concern. So it's no mystery that in our own private spheres, we'll do things like give out a friends and family discount or help a neighbor in need, right? But what if the friends and family is a government that is spending someone else's money instead? There, what you might find is that a government official is more willing to overspend, is willing to give a contract to not the lowest bidder, but to the most well-connected bidder. And that becomes a form of predation. I'm reminded of, I think it was Buzz Aldrin said that when he was sitting in the Apollo rocket, all he could think about was that all the parts that were built were the ones from the lowest bid, right? But that's not true. Right, that's a rose-tinted and somewhat sanguine version of how government contracting works. Often, what happens is the people who are most well-connected are the ones that get the contract. Now, they can't charge $10 million for a paperclip, right? That wouldn't fly all that well. But we do see things like the Air Force in 2013 paying $1,300 for a coffee mug. Right, and the coffee mug, here's the thing about the coffee mug. So the Air Force pilots want to drink coffee while they're flying their jets. Makes sense to me. I drink coffee while I'm driving a minivan. I feel like it's roughly analogous, right? And so, but they want their coffee to be warm. Hey, can't fault them for that. But because they're on sorties for so long, they need to have a powered cup, not unlike one of those Ember cups that you and I might buy. But if you're in a fighter jet, well, you can't just have an Ember cup that costs $150. You got to have a special cup that plugs into the special electrical outlet that's in the cockpit. Well, that's expensive. And of course, you can't have just a regular handle. it's got to be a ceramic handle that's comfortable and easy to grip even when your hands are sweaty and shaking from the plane. So all of a sudden, this cup costs about $1,300 because of all the custom and unique hardware in it, right? And that ceramic handle could break very easily. So if you actually accidentally like dropped your cup, even just like tipped it over on the table, right, the handle would shatter. Now, okay, just replace the handle. Nay, can't do that. Can't replace the handle. You have to buy a whole new cup. Okay? And so what happened is the Air Force was spending a tremendous amount of money on coffee cups every year. Right? So is that part of the productive state? Yeah, they were giving their pilots coffee. But I submit to you that the excessive amount of money spent on coffee cups is a form of the predatory state. Same thing with the Pentagon, right? If you, how many of you have ever, not to be gross, but how many of you have ever used a toilet? Anyone sat on a $600 toilet seat before? If you work at the Pentagon, that's all they have. Now, do you need a $600 toilet seat? My guess is no, right? So again, people need to use the commode. That's a productive use of taxpayer money. Do they need a $600 custom molded toilet seat? Maybe not. That'll be part of the predatory. So as soon as you unleash the ability of government to purchase things, you're going to have to safeguard against what sorts of things they spend their money on and purchase and what the terms of those contracts are. So the predatory state is not always a nefarious, like, I'm going to give, money to my friends and punish my enemies. That's not always the case. It could be as simple as a $600 toilet seat or a $1,300 coffee mug. That would all fall under the predatory state as well.
Great, thank you.
Chris, did you have anything else?
No,
okay. So my name is James Franco. I'm the president of Kansas Policy Institute. As Russ said, the Pearson and EB Academy is kind of a joint venture, I would say, of the Gordon Institute and KPI, trying to just help think about some of these ideas, kind of backing up a step from where I spend most of my time with the legislature and those kind of things and thinking about the policy, but then also wanting to have an application side of these things as well, not just as wonderful as it is to be in a college campus, not just academic, but actually like real world, no fiddle sticking around where the rubber meets the roads with these kind of things. So thank you all for coming. Join us next month, April 25th. We're talking about the First Amendment with KPI's litigator, Sam McRoberts. Check your local broadcast listings for the time and place. So a question on that, and then I have a follow-up question, then we'll open it up to everybody else. So you mentioned Tim Cook, right? And him, buying off a subsidy relief or tariff relief, right? So on one hand, it is who is to blame in that regard? Is it the politician in this particular instance, or is it Tim Cook? And then somebody might argue in a cynical way to say, actually, he has a fiduciary responsibility to his shareholders, whoever they may be, right, public, private, company, or what have you, to seek that relief because his job is to look out for his shareholders' best interest. So it is more productive for Tim Cook in this example to spend that $1 million, whether it's his money or Apple money, to get the relief so that his shareholders benefit from not having to pay this subsidy, or pay the tariff, forgive me. So, two things. Does he have a fiduciary responsibility? And then, which came first, the rent seeker?
Or the rent creation?
Or the rent creation.
Yeah, excellent question. Yeah, okay, so this is one, so I have an article in The Hill actually getting after this one.
I didn't tee him up for that.
No, you did not, because it's an older article. It's been a while. I feel like, Obi-Wan Kenobi or whatever I say. It's an older one, right? But, whatever. So the idea here is a great question. Okay, so the idea is whose fault is the rent? Is it the buyer's fault or the seller's fault? Now, here's the question, the way that I think about this. And I'm presenting it as my way to think about it. I'm not going to present it as the way, but I want you to hear it because it's a bit unique. So a lot of people say, politicians just can't say no. They can't help themselves from being captured by big business, right? And to an extent, that's not false. Okay, so that would suggest that it's Tim Cook's fault for seeking these rents. But here's kind of my question: is what do you mean politicians can't say no? Like that means that like corporations and big businesses are effectively bossing around Washington, D.C. Now, I don't know if you've heard about this, but there's this little thing called like the U.S. military, right? So the very idea that like Tim Cook could boss around Donald Trump is laughable. I'm not suggesting using the military to like attack Apple, right? But here's the thing, like there's no universe in which, you know, Tim Cook like walks in and says, hey, Donnie, do this or else. And Donald Trump is like, oh my God, he's gonna come after me. Like, what's he gonna do, turn off my iPhone? It's like, I command the USS Reagan, right? Like, let's go, right? And so, to me, the idea that politicians can't say no is just absurd, which means that it's their fault for saying yes, okay? So when a rent is sought, it has to also be, you know, given or created, okay? So for me, it's all about the politician is actually, you know, saying yes. And what we should then be trying to do is find ways to remove their ability to say yes, right? So that's the real issue. So when you look at, I wrote this one in advance of the 2016 election. Okay, so in 2014, to give you some context, Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton had a reported income of a combined $28 million per year. And Donald Trump reports to have made in 2014 $362 million. Now, as president, their salary is about $400,000 to $450,000 per year. So here's my question: is in what universe would anyone want to give up $28 million per year to make $400,000 to $450,000? Right? And the answer is that there must be some other means by which they're making money off of this, right? And the answer is selling these favors. So for me, the issue is not that, you know, corporations seek the rents. I actually agree with the Milton Friedman-esque point that you made, that because, you know, corporations have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders, they have somewhat of an obligation to seek those rents and to get that reprieve. But the problem then is that government has the power to say yes, right? That to me is the issue. So if you can restrain government from saying yes to so many things, then you can get rid of the cronyism, the favoritism. You can have sort of the rules, right? It's like, why do we have a law that says, you know, referees can't bet on the sports games that they're officiating, right? Like that makes total sense. If we got rid of that law, what would happen? Right, it would be a disaster. So that's the idea, is we need to find a way to tie the hands of government officials. The challenge is that they have to tie the hands themselves, right? So like I can create, you know, we can create a law that says referees can't bet. They're not the ones creating that rule, tying their own hands. The problem is that government has to tie their hands, and that's really hard.
So I have lots of other questions, but we'll stay on this theme for a second. So less about, you know, kind of national policy, but at the state level. It's not simply big sweeping cronyist schemes sometimes. There was a bill that passed a couple of years ago in the Kansas legislature that in effect gave $1 billion to Panasonic to open a battery plant of some sort or another in DeSoto, Kansas, so just on kind of the western edge of the Kansas City metro area. Okay, I'm sure you're eminently familiar with our geography here. So if it's something like this, where it's not Tim Cook giving, you know, money for a ballroom or, you know, what inauguration or whatever it was, but it is Panasonic saying, essentially, we are going to come to our state, and we are going to build a plant. We're going to employ the people in the construction of the plant, to say nothing of the development of that plant over the next 20, 30, 50, 500 years, whatever it is. We're going to build this somewhere, Kansas.
Yeah. Who's going to pay the money?
Who's going to pay the money? Is it going to be you or Oklahoma or South Carolina? And in that regard, how do you balance this need for limited government with the very real constraint of a state like Kansas that doesn't have a lot of job growth? You talked about migration and voting with your feet and whatnot, and saying, okay, this is kind of a devil's bargain here, where I say no to this, but if I do, what am I really saying no to?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So for me, you know, I look at tax incentives and tax breaks on that kind of stuff. I actually don't see too much of an issue. That's, you know, a local government trying to compete on a marketplace to woo business, and that is the idea of voting with your feet in action. That's what the whole disciplinary act is supposed to be, is, hey, if you want me to come and be part of your tax base, you need to make it attractive to me to do that. Now, do I like the idea that one company, because they're so big, is getting that tax break? Not as much, right? That's certainly going to make it harder for smaller people, because at the end of the day, Kansas legislature needs X number of dollars per year to operate. And if Panasonic, in this case, isn't going to be contributing as much to them, or is going to be taking money out, as the case may be, that means that everyone else is going to have to put more in, right? So that's going to be a problem. But there, I would say the real thing is to figure out how to operate the Kansas budget in such a way that everyone is getting those exemptions, or that $100 million hit or whatever it is, doesn't actually impact the bottom line for the state in an appreciable way.
It's not the answer I was expecting.
Yeah, I try to be. Yeah.
I've got more questions, but
I just want to throw this out here and get your perspective.
Yeah.
Okay, tariffs. Okay. First 150 years of the Republic, we had a high tariff.
Sure did.
That did a good job of funding most of government, and turned the nation into the world's #1 economic power.
Okay.
In 1992, Ross Perot ran for president, and opposing the North American Free Trade Agreement, which basically eliminated a lot of tariffs. And his argument against it was that if this would pass, there would be a hollowing out of the American manufacturing sector, and all of those jobs would be sucked out of the country and go overseas. In recent years, China has had high tariffs and has turned into the #2 economic power in the world.
Yep.
I'm just throwing that out. I mean, it would say that there is some political incentive to argue for tariffs in behalf of the workforce. Okay, and I'm just.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Sure. So everyone is correct to point out that prior to 1913, when we passed the income tax amendment to the Constitution, most, if not near all, federal revenue came from tariffs. Yeah, very limited government. Now, here's what I want to point out. Okay, so the U.S. government today spends about $7.2 trillion per year. They collect $2.6 trillion per year in income taxes. Under even audacious assumptions from Pete Navarro, the tariffs that were implemented about a year ago would be raising about $600 billion per year. So we're significantly short of replacing income taxes. And that's even ignoring the fact that we're running a $1.2 trillion deficit every year. So the tariff revenue would pay off half of the deficit, in other words, the shortage between spending and revenues. But people are correct. They point out that in the 19th century, the U.S. used tariffs to raise money. The question is why? Okay, so why did they do it? First off, the state of technology was quite low, so assessing people's income, even if it were constitutional, which we did try during the Civil War, was actually really difficult. Right? Imagine for a minute that I come up to you and say, hey, how much money did you make last year so I know how much money to tax you based on how much money you made? What are you going to say?
$2.
Yeah, I made about $2, right? And so they'll be like, oh, cool, you only owe me 10% of $2, right? Even if you made $3, you might have an incentive to misreveal your preferences. Same thing with sales taxes, right? We didn't have the technology to keep track of sales taxes either. What we did have was an incredible ability to watch the limited number of ports where things were coming in. And we could assess the value of things coming into that port and then tax them appropriately. So from a technological standpoint, tariffs were incredibly efficient in the sense that all other things were difficult. Okay? The second thing is to think about how much money does Congress spend. So here, I'll just give you the top 5 items that Congress spends money on this year. Okay, so Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, defense, and net interest on the national debt. Those 5 items alone, combined, account for about $5.2 trillion of federal spending. Okay? Social Security wasn't signed into law until 1935. Interest payments on the national debt in the 19th century were basically zero. Medicare and Medicaid didn't start until 1965. And military spending in the 1800s was a mere $88 million in today's dollars compared to the $1.4 trillion that we have now. Okay, so my response to people who say, and I'm not accusing you of saying this, but I get this one a lot, is, if you want to run the federal government off of tariff revenue, you absolutely can. You're going to have to completely axe Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, national defense, and somehow find a way to pay off the entire national debt so that you don't have $1.2 trillion in debt interest payments. Now, does that sound like a feasible scenario in anytime soon? Probably not. So the idea that the tariffs are actually going to replace any of that is just not true. As the kids would say, the math ain't mathin'. Okay? The second part of the claim is that tariffs actually led to the manufacturing boom in the United States. And while there is some evidence of that, what we find is that in years where tariffs were actually reduced, so we should be clear that there was variation in tariff rates and over time, but also variation in tariff rates across industry. Okay, so which industries do you think grew the fastest? The ones that were tariffed the most or the ones that were tariffed the least? Because here's the thing. People often build tariffs as a protectionist thing, which means that it's going to protect the domestic industry and allow it to flourish. Having said all that, which industries grew the fastest? The ones that were highly tariffed or the ones that were lowly tariffed?
Lowly tariffed.
Lowly, okay? And here's the other thing. Growth in manufacturing accelerated every time we lowered tariffs across the board. So it is certainly true that manufacturing took off in the 19th century in the United States, and it is certainly true that we had extraordinarily high tariffs relative to what we have even today. But those are two historical accidents. They are not necessarily correlated or related. I'm sorry, they are correlated. They're not related or causally linked in any way, shape, or form. What we find is actually the opposite. When we have lower tariffs, what you find is faster growth. Now, I will say, as a public finance person who believes that there is at least one proper role for government, right? So I'm not one of those anarcho-capitalist people. But insofar as there are legitimate roles of government, they're going to need money to pay for it. And so you can make the case, as I've tried to do in the past, that even if we accept that tariffs led to lower growth in particular industries, they funded the government, and having a government was better than not. And they made a lot of things possible. So I have no issues saying that tariffs were okay in the 19th century. They were a constrained optimization. They were the best we could do. Fortunately, today we have far better means of doing things than tariffs, and we should use those means today. Yeah. Oh, on China, we didn't talk about that. So let me briefly mention China. So China is an economic superpower. True. Here's the thing that I'll say, right? And like you all know this. Like if I said China has a lot of people in it, what would you think? You'd be like, yup, 1.5 billion people. Here's the thing about Chinese manufacturing. They produce about 60% more output than we do in their manufacturing sector. Some people put it at double. I'll use double. We can go with that number. I'm fine with that. Okay? How many people in the US are employed in the manufacturing sector today? The answer is 12.7 million. Okay? That's a lot of people. How many people are employed in the US, period, right now? About 157 million. Okay? How many people are employed in China in manufacturing today, right now?
200 million.
200, it's not fair, you know the answer, right? 212 million people. In other words, China employs more people in manufacturing alone than the US employs people. China is not an economic superpower. They are a giant country with a ton of people throwing it at a singular problem called manufacturing, right? As I was telling Dr. McCullough last night, you give me 1 million people and I coordinate them, right? I can build that garage apartment complex in 20 minutes. Right? Everyone swings a hammer once or pushes a saw blade once, done. Right? We can get it done super fast. Right? As it turns out, the American worker is 8 times as productive as any Chinese worker at a minimum, if not more than 8 times as productive. So if anything, the American worker doesn't need to be protected from China. They need to be unleashed on China. Now, call me weird, but I happen to believe in the American worker. Right? I think that they can actually succeed. I think that if they go toe-to-toe with any other country in the world, they'll win. If any country in the world needs protectionist policies, it's not the United States. It's every other country from us. Because if we're able to get into their market, we will dominate it and win. So that's what we've done for 250 years. Right? And so do we need the protectionism here? Absolutely not. We need to get the resources into the hands of the most productive people on the planet. We need to unleash them on the rest of the world and watch them actually take over, just like what Ronald Reagan did in the 80s.
So two things, and this is really more commentary for the other individuals in the room. Previously you mentioned that bill in 1997 that limited the number of medical residencies. It's worth noting that despite shortfalls in the population growth, I believe 60 million people since that was originally passed, that wasn't updated until 2020 at the height of COVID.
Yeah.
Which, that's appalling, and really we're talking about limited government, and it's worth mentioning that government doesn't update its regulations to adjust to issues. The other thing is mentioning the increase in cost. I recently came across a stat that indicated that it's either 1980 or 1990 we were spending 5% of American GDP on healthcare, and now it's ballooned to 18% of GDP, which, given a 20 million, or sorry, not million, trillion gross domestic product, that is highly concerning.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So, this is exactly what we see, right, is when we get involved in trying to make, something more affordable and more accessible. It's like, listen, I have no problem with the goal, right? Like, if you tell me, like, hey, Dave, you don't want to make people, you want people to not have access to healthcare. Nothing could be further from the truth. My goal is to get more people better and cheaper access to healthcare, right? That's the goal. The question is, how do we get there? And what we've found is over the last 45 years or longer, we have been pushing and pushing and pushing on the demand side of the healthcare market. And that's just going to bid the prices up. Now, for a long time, supply was allowed to expand to match that, right? But then in 1997, we passed the 1996 Budget Act, which froze it. You're correct to point out that in 2020, they lifted some of that cap. And there is a bill, or at least there was last summer, I don't know what happened to it, that would raise the cap by 1,000 residency slots per year for the next 10. Cool. Right? Yeah, not enough. Now you're only short 70,000 physicians instead of 80. Like, that's progress. I don't dispute that. And you do, when people ask you, like, how do you eat an elephant? It's one bite at a time, right? So I don't dispute any of that. But at the same time, like, you could actually just bite the whole elephant and just repeal that law. And then there would be a lot more residency slots, which means there could be a lot more physicians. Because here's kind of the thing. If you go to medical school and you don't get a residency slot, what do you become? You could become a GP or a general practitioner, but like that's about it. And that's fine. It's a great life. It's not a bad gig at all, right? But you're never going to be the specialized person. You're never going to be able to see the highly complicated cases that America faces today. So, excuse me, hang on. Sorry about that. So, in a world where the needs of people to go to the physician or to see the doctor have been growing and growing and growing as we, one, live longer, two, continue to eat foods that don't exactly help us live longer, and three, take medications that come with lots of side effects that we might want to, guard against or deal with. The need for more and more health care as we all get older is only going to grow, and it's going to be beyond the scope of, your general practitioner. That's fine. And so what we find, right, is that people end up not being able to see the doctor that they need, right? That's a problem. We're going to need to address that in some way, shape, or form. But again, that's the supply side. The supply side's got to catch up with the demand side.
Third item to mention there, also those limited medical residencies kind of force, for one of a better phrase, the export of medical students, because you can get medical residencies in Europe or South America or Africa or Asia as well.
Yep. Yeah, but there it's often difficult to prove that the standard of care or standard of training is sufficiently high to go and practice, to come back and practice in the U.S.
Well, the added aspect there that I was trying to get at is that you go out abroad, you build a life there. Do you want to really move all the stuff you have if you're in Europe back to America?
Right. Yep.
Like, that's a 12-hour flight just to visit your family.
Yeah. I mean, that's the issue, right? Is we end up sending a lot of physicians out to the rest of the world, which is great for them, but maybe we need them here. And it would sure be nice if they could stay here.
I've got something I want you to expand on. So you brought up the Tebow hypothesis with the voting with your feet.
Yep.
And here in Kansas, we had the Chiefs Stadium relocating from Missouri to our great state of Kansas. And then definitely some question marks on whether the taxes will, end up eventually going up. But then there might be other benefits of property values near the stadium, and all kinds of complexities to it. And so my question is, what can you comment on? Do people really move? Is there evidence out there of people leaving jurisdictions? And then is that a concern? I don't expect you to speak on this, but like for Kansas, if we continue to do policies like that and our tax rates stay high, that's running contrary to what we're trying to accomplish, is to keep people here and attract people here.
Yeah.
And so can you comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we do find evidence of people moving between jurisdictions, especially when there's a major jurisdictional line nearby. So this is kind of the perfect area for this. So the simple fact that you can drive like 20 miles and be in Missouri, right, which is not just a different county, but a different state, is huge, right? So the competition between, Kansas and Missouri in this particular area is very fierce. And the reason for it is because a lot of times what we find is people are reluctant to move like long distances just to save some money on taxes, right? So like I live in Grand Rapids, Michigan. If they increase their taxes by like 10%, which would be a huge increase, right? I'm not going to move to like California. Right. The reason I'm not going to move to California, period. But my little brother's out in LA. I can go hang out with him. But here's the other side of it. My wife and her grew up in the town we live in now. Right. All of her friends from high school are within 5 miles. My mom and her husband live 2 miles down the road. My son's elementary school is 1 mile down the road. His middle school, when he gets to that age, will be 1 mile down the road. The high school is right across the street from the middle school. My in-laws live 4 miles the other way. So the community that I have in this area is very thick, right? It's incredibly important and it's very valuable to me, right? So to get me to move out of there is not just going to be like a small thing. It's going to have to be a major change, right? I'm going to give up free babysitting, which, as anyone with children knows, that if you can get free babysitting, holy smokes, right? They're charging like $25 an hour per kid now. It's crazy, right? Grandma and grandpa do it for free. In fact, they often bring dinner, which is wonderful. So that's like paying you to watch their kids, right? So it's wonderful. Okay, so, but would I move 20 miles to save 10% on my taxes? Maybe. If it's sufficiently high or sufficiently annoying or sufficiently capricious, yeah, I might move 20 miles. So here's the thing. When you have a jurisdictional border that's nearby, yeah, you can move. And it's actually not going to cost you your community, right? But when it does cost your community, then you see people being a lot more reluctant to move. So the TBU model breaks down a little bit when you have thick communities and the border is sufficiently far away, right? This is why like every election when people are like, if so and so wins, I'm moving to Canada. I'm like, no, you're not. Like, just stop it. You're not going to move to Canada. We all know you're lying. Knock it off, right? Now, people do retire and go like to Mexico. That's true, but oftentimes their community has dwindled. The benefits are sufficiently high. Prices are very low, right? Things go a lot better. So yeah, it works.
So, yeah, to maybe follow that up just a little bit, is do politicians then get to use that to their advantage, that these networks and communities aren't going to move, or they tend to be sticky for those reasons you just said? Do you think politicians, at least in the back of their mind, think they have more liberty to do foolish things?
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. So I mean, once ground is breaking on something, the temptation to kind of reverse your agreement is always going to be there. But here's kind of the thing. That works once. Right? It doesn't work in perpetuity. So let's say Panasonic starts building their factory, right outside town. And then Kansas City says, ha-ha, you've broken ground and you're almost done. I'm going to start charging you full price plus extra, right? Well, okay, Panasonic's not going to pack up their factory and move. So you're probably going to win that one. But what happens when Apple wants to build a new factory and they're looking at Kansas City, and Kansas City says, hey, we'll give you a tax break, but they pull up recent history and say, well, look what you did to Panasonic. No, right? So those types of things can work once. They tend not to work repeatedly, which makes them a really, really poor long-term strategy.
Excuse me, I was sitting here listening, and as a homeschooling mom, stay-at-home mom, I look at things from a perspective of on a very, very basic level, because when I hear you talk about government and big government, and I think about where we started as a country and where we are now with the government, I see this sequoia tree. And as I look at the sequoia tree, I'm like, how do you cut down a sequoia tree versus a small palm tree, where I'm originally from in the Bahamas?
Yeah.
You can easily cut down, even if the hurricane hit it hard enough, it can just come down, but a sequoia can just withstand storm after storm, and so you start to become overwhelmed.
Yeah.
And you don't just sit in these, at least I don't just sit in a setting like this thinking like, okay, I gained some information. I'm coming to say, okay, even as an individual or with my small sphere of influence, how do I take this information back and say, how can we be active, feet on the ground, and begin to do something even on a small level to begin to maybe just reduce government on a local level and make this something that is effective and doing something, not just information to gather and store in a notebook.
Yeah. John, on this.
I think Karen is brilliant where she's going with this. And I'll just anecdotally talk about where I'm recently from, the Omaha, Nebraska area, where you have urban areas that are very in difficult socioeconomic strata there. And the public schools, the government schools are doing a miserable job. And the ones that literally are outperforming incredibly without the money are the Catholic schools. And these children are not even Catholic. They're in these urban schools. Their scores, their academic achievements are through the roof. They're spending less per capita on these kids. The parishioners literally are underwriting scholarships so that these kids can go to school there. They're not even spending half what the government schools are spending. And I say it's not fair to call them private schools. They're public, they're open. They have every Latino, every refugee, African Americans, and they're literally outperforming the government schools at every vector for less money. And it just seems like, as you said before, government gets in this predatory state, and I notice the reaction is always, well, we have to punish them, they're achieving too much.
Right, yeah.
So in Kansas now, they're mad that some of the Catholic schools are winning state basketball championships.
Right.
They've won too many, we have to
Right.
punish them, we
Right,
have to
right.
segregate them,
Yeah.
separate but equal.
Yeah.
And my follow-up question too is, didn't we see this predatory nature under a protective modality cause the 08-09 housing collapse?
Yeah. So in terms of what you can do, what I would say, the first thing is protecting choice and freedom of movement and freedom of exit. Right now that includes moving to a different county, different state, whatever is nearby, but it also includes, as John was mentioning, freedom to go to different schools. Right. So we find. So I happen to be on the board for a charter school just south of Grand Rapids. I'm not going to say the names. I don't want them to get associated with anything in case of any shenanigans or whatever. But they located where they did because of the quality of the local school system was pretty poor. Right? They had something like a 25% graduation rate for the public school before this charter school started. So like a quick note on like a charter school. It's not a private school. It's anyone can come. It uses state taxpayer money to pay for everything. It doesn't cost the parents anything. If they get to a point where they don't have capacity, they use a lottery system. There's no exam to get in. We don't get to pick who comes in and who doesn't. It's all as random as it can be. Okay, so it's fair, and as fair as we can make it. And what we found is in the 25 years since this school was started, the high school graduation rate at our school and the public school has gone up to something like 80%. The amount of crime in the area has plummeted. Recidivism, or the idea that like a person who goes to jail or gets in trouble with the law then commits a subsequent crime has fallen as well. The community is safer, it's cleaner, there are more jobs and more opportunities there. And all of that comes down to the choice that people had and the ability to exit a system that wasn't working for them. Okay, so when you have that ability, when you protect the ability of people to say, no, I'm not going to send my kid to this school, I'm going to homeschool or charter school or private school them, right? That can be tremendously powerful because it disciplines the local public school, okay? The second thing is to think about, especially at the local level where you actually have a chance to, change things, right? If you make it so that anyone can understand the law, right? So you don't need legal training like JD here, right, to understand what's going on, right? You can actually start to see, what's going on in the law. What are we voting on, right? When you make, they're usually called like sunshine laws. So where if you just say, look, we've got to be transparent, we've got to be clear about what this is doing, right? Written in a way that someone with a 10th grade level of reading comprehension can understand and think seriously about what this is. When you start getting into like wherewithal, to whom it's, all that, you're like, whoa, like even just that sentence was hard for me to say, right? And I've got a Ph.D., right? So like, you got to drop it down, not because the population is not intelligent. It's just you need to make sure that everyone who is capable of voting on something can understand what it is that they're voting on and cast that informed vote that everyone says that we're supposed to be doing, right? Very good. There's lots of great examples of this at the local level. At the federal level, good luck, right? But you can absolutely start at the local level, get that movement going. Because here's the thing, like most of your life is determined by the local, not the federal, despite the fact that everyone pays way more attention to the federal level than the local. So I would just focus there, right? Make sure that you protect choice, you protect the ability of people to exit, bad situations, including education, but like neighborhoods, taxes, et cetera. And then just make sure that everyone can understand what's actually being voted on. And if you can do those two things, really, things tend to get a lot better, a lot faster.
That's good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Does anybody have another question? I've got one that maybe we'll tie a couple of things together here a little bit, or I'll try, and then you can react and close. So we're talking about education and the power of exit and subsidies in a constrained market.
Yeah.
There is a bill in the Kansas legislature, it's on its way to the governor's desk if it isn't already there, that would, excuse me, it is an expansion of a tax credit scholarship. So this is an idea of school choice. It's not an ESA or what have you, right? It's, somebody gives money to a nonprofit, that nonprofit then turns around and gives scholarships to some other kid. The question isn't about the workings of this particular bill, it's broadly about school choice. So as I'm talking to legislators about this bill, they're like, well, we can't do that.
Yeah.
Because what it's really going to do is it's going to lead to the government takeover of schools.
Yeah.
And it's going to the subsidy point, inflate the cost of private education. Because if all of a sudden we are giving, little Jimmy Franco what amounts to a subsidy to attend a private school instead of going to a public school, it's going to inflate the cost, as we've seen in higher ed.
Yeah.
I'm sure lots of people in this room have used or are using some form of federal student aid of one sort or another, right? So you can take that question kind of wherever you want to go. I have a certain set of answers. But how does that equate with, your comments about subsidies and market size and market growth and these kind of things? And then part of that same bill is also opting into a federal school choice program that was passed in the One Big Beautiful Bill that passed in the summer of 2025. And we've talked about, you've alluded to it, I don't think you've used the term of subsidiarity, right? Where government is done as close to an individual as possible, not just looking to DC, but looking to our local governments, our school districts, the state, what have you.
Yeah.
So how, again, you can take that wherever you want.
Yeah.
If it's on the subsidy question of non-public education, if it's on the role of the federal government in something where up to this point it has been limited in education, so it's not national defense where we can all agree we need something,
Right.
but it is, what is the role of the federal government in education? So the floor is yours.
Okay,
Go wherever you
perfect. That's a big question. Okay, so I will do, let me think about this and say two kind of things. One very short and one maybe a little longer winded. So on the first part, what I would say is when you subsidize something, a genuine subsidy, right, which is distinct, and maybe this is where we potentially disagreed earlier, which is distinct from not taxing. So I don't view exemptions to a tax as a subsidy, right? I view that just as not taxing. Right? So a subsidy is like giving someone money to go do a thing. That's going to lead inexorably to higher prices for the very thing that you're trying to make more affordable. So for that one, I would say, do your best to resist that one. Right? The access point will be nullified in very short order. Prices will rise unless you're going to also allow and create more seats in the school, but that's usually not true. So I would say that. And then the other side, insofar as we're going to use national policy for something, it's important to keep in mind that national policy by definition applies to all 50 states. Okay, so how many of you have been to like this place called, I don't know, Alabama or Florida? Is it different from Kansas? Right? How many of you have been to California? Is it different from Kansas? How many of you have been to New York? Is it different from here? Right? And so the idea is that different places have sort of different cultural aspects, different, sort of values. This is the idea behind like, so I got a lot of flack from my boss in the Joint Economic Committee at one point because he was supporting something, and I said, well, if we really wanted to help, export democracy around the world, we should just email everyone a copy of the Constitution. Done, right? And so he said, why? I'm like, well, if it's such a great document, it should just work. Right? And he said, well, that won't work. I'm like, interesting point, why not? Right? And so it turns out the rules that we have in the US Constitution are great for the US. They're not so great for the Middle East. They just don't fundamentally, they don't match the values and cultures and beliefs of different people. So the rules that we have here don't apply there. When you have a national policy, that is saying that we're going to have a one-size-fits-all policy despite the tremendous variation across states. So like what's valuable for education in Michigan, for example, could be radically different from what's valuable for education in, say, Alabama. And it's not because, we are these enlightened people and they're these knavish Southerners, right? It's not because of anything like that. It's because we have a fundamentally different way of understanding the world. So I used to work at Troy University. Troy University is in Troy, Alabama, right? I'm from the North. I've never not lived in the North until then. I remember when I was there, I would be at work past like 3:30 in the afternoon. And my boss would come up to me and say, Dave, you need to get yourself a girl and go sit and drink some sweet tea. It's 3:30 in the afternoon. What are you doing in the office? And I instantly was like, I completely understand why the North has more wealth than the South, right? I also completely understand why the South is happier than the North, right? And it's like, this makes total sense, right? And it's not, like, they're not wrong, right? And the Northerners are like, we're not wrong either. We just have different values, right? And if you have a one-size-fits-all policy that's going to fit those two cultures, that's going to be really difficult unless it's something like national defense, right? That's easy. Education policy, though, you probably want to have the state and local governments as involved as possible in the particular aspects of education, because that will match not just the belief systems, but the educational needs of the people there. Because the truth is, most people don't move that far from home. I understand that college is a little bit different because you go further for college, but most people end up moving back to their state or something to that effect. So to me, having the federal government involved in education is one of the worst, most disastrous things. Not in the sense that, so think of it this way. It's not that I want to see, people teaching wrong things, right? I think we can all agree on certain facts, but what does the educational system emphasize, right? That's going to be different depending on where you are. And so having states involved as much as possible, that's to me the correct way to do it. A lot of people use the federal government as a means of redistributing money across the 50 states, right? To the point where now it's something like a third of every state's budget comes from the federal government. Why? Where does the federal government get the money from? Well, it's got to be from the people. The people live in states, right? So why are we introducing a new middleman that is less efficient, right? when we could just send that money to your state government instead and have them use the money directly. The other side there is when you do get the federal government involved in redistributing the money, it often comes with strings. So my colleague, Tom Savage, has a paper out on this about the strings attached with federal funds, right? That can be used to steer things in particular ways that end up in the cronyism and the predatory state aspect that we were talking about earlier. So I guess to your question, I would say no, like get the federal government out of education, keep state and local as involved as possible, right? And really keep parents as involved as possible.
And I just as a point, and then we'll wrap up here really quick, is not only that, but then the fundamental idea of school choice, I just can't help myself, sorry, right, is that it's not just the local communities that are dealing with these things, right? It's that my belief system might be different than yours and different than Russ's. And if it's secular, religious, of whatever denominational flavor or what have you want, is that we should be able to take that money that we are paying in taxes and use that for, if my kid struggles to read, I should be able to find the correct intervention for him. And then if the other one's great at math, find the correct intervention for them, which is a little bit of a different. And then we'll close right here.
Did someone there also, I thought.
I'm sorry, did I see another hand?
I also do have a small point, although it's not the biggest.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, please.
Defer.
Going back to the federal government gets detached from the schools, they're not going to notice that the school I graduated from, they built a brand new school the year I graduated. They didn't put the doorstops in. So somebody got to come back in and fix all that, install those the next year. Somebody also, the air conditioning units were supposed to be fed from a retention pond. There was supposed to be a sensor installed to monitor when the water level dropped too low, so it would be fed from the plumbing instead. They forgot to install that, so you had two $25,000 AC units burn out.
Oh, lovely. Yeah.
Which federal government's not going to track that. They're not going to see either of those.
No, look, Linda McMahon's going to come flying in off the top rope and drop an elbow on the HVAC systems, and there you go. Right, so, yeah.
Do you want to wrap up?
I think my esteemed colleague is a bit of a philosopher king. I loved it that you invoked subsidiarity. And Doctor, I'd like you to maybe just talk about that. It's kind of like blood pressure, diastolic, systolic, solidarity, but subsidiarity. Even as a legal theory of justice, we examine it a lot. Can subsidiarity be an anchor or a hinge or a bulwark to advance federalism or limited government? Is that a good zeitgeist to be in that subsidiarity camp? Right?
We've referenced it, but if
Yeah.
you define it as well.
Well,
I'm glad you brought that up. That was
I guess what I want to do, and I'm not trying to dodge anything, but can you guys define what you mean by subsidiarity, just so I understand exactly what it is?
So the way I would define it is that you are deciding things as close to the effective party.
Absolutely.
Okay. Got it.
Instead of, at the extreme we were talking about education, instead of having one national school system, right,
decisions
for all
are
50
best
states.
made at the most fundamental local
Yes.
level.
Okay.
Ideally
Just
family,
wanted-
then neighborhood, then school district, then city, then county.
Yep. Just wanted to make sure we're all working with, because unlike some, I think the words and definitions matter. So I wanted to make sure. Okay, so there, it's important to keep in mind that when you have, let's say, one national policy, what are the odds that you got it right? And what are the incentives for you to improve over time, okay? Versus thinking about having 50 state governments creating policies and experimenting in some way, right? Now, I said this to some folks last night. Here's kind of the thing. When you all as students copy and paste and don't give proper attribution, it's illegal, right? You get in trouble. When a state government finds a policy from another state that works, and they copy and paste, it's called genius, okay? And so there's different standards, I agree, but whatever. Okay, so if Indiana did something smart and Michigan copied it, we'd be like, heck yeah, this is amazing, right? Good job, bully on you, Jennifer Granholm, right? And so we'd be thrilled. But when you have 50 different, areas, each trying their own thing, you can look around and see what's actually working. And then you can copy the things that work and avoid the things that don't. And it gets even better when you start realizing that there are thousands upon thousands of counties, right? So now instead of having just 50 laboratories, I can have thousands of them. And if I can get that information quickly and understand it and parse it, which is hard, but hey, ChatGPT exists now, so here we go, right? When I can look at, what's going on in the world and what's working at the county level, and then I can bring that to my county as it applies, right? So I'm not going to subsidize palm trees in Grand Rapids, Michigan, right? Bad idea, right? But it might make total sense to subsidize or to create green spaces in particular ways, and I can look at how are other counties pulling that off. And I can copy it, right? And say, hey, this is working for you. Let's try it here. And if it works, great. If it didn't, I can look around at the other counties and figure out why it didn't work, right? So there, I think if you start local, figure out what's working at the local level, you can build up at the federal level. Now, it's going to necessitate you being very clear about the delineations of what sorts of problems are appropriate to solve at the national level. So we were talking last night, democracy is great. I don't use it with my kids, right? The kids don't get to vote on what they have for dinner, right? I get to decide, huh?
Oreos.
Yeah, Oreos. Hot dogs from Sam's Club is their recent favorite, which
Dino Nuggies.
They hate Dino Nuggies. I may have, partially been responsible for creating them, but I am not causing that one, right? And so, yeah, they're weird kids. Listen, my son almost knows calculus. He's 6, right? And he doesn't like Dino Nuggets. He's a weird kid, right? But whatever, okay? So we don't use democracy at the dinner table, right? We don't use charity, and we also shouldn't be using charity at the federal level, right? There's rooms or scope for these things of how you solve these sorts of problems, right? Hayek referred to them as the macrocosmos versus the microcosmos. Adam Smith, since it's 250 years since The Wealth of Nations, you can read Theory of Moral Sentiments as how to live well within your community, and then The Wealth of Nations as how to live well in the world, right? They're different. Right, so Das Adam Smith problem only exists if you don't understand that there's a difference between your community and the world. Right? As soon as you understand that, you're like, oh, there is no Adam Smith problem. Right? It's the same thing. And so what I would say is, you need to have that experimentation. You need to figure out what's working. But you also need to have the restraints that say this is not a national problem. This is a local problem. We're going to solve it. The example I'll give, and I'll wrap it up here. Remember last fall when SNAP benefits expired, or when the president just decided to withhold them, and everyone said, oh my God, millions of people are going to starve to death. It didn't happen. Yeah. Why didn't it happen? As it turns out, the American people are incredibly charitable. And what happened is millions upon millions of people found a need, identified it, stepped up, and filled that need. That's a beautiful solution to a problem. I don't deny that some people have access to problems getting food. That's true. I don't deny that I have too much access to food, right? That's a problem too. There's a world in which I could take some of the food that I have in my pantry and give it to someone. I live healthier, they don't die. That's amazing. We should do that, right? But that was a local solution to a local problem. It didn't require the federal solution to a local problem.
Okay, thank you.